What if the thing that made you extraordinary was also the thing quietly pulling you toward ruin? Not from the outside, not from your enemies, from somewhere deeper, somewhere you couldn't see or refuse to look. Psychology tells us that the most dangerous forces in a person's life are rarely the ones they can name. They're the ones buried beneath the surface, the ones that move in silence, the ones that wear the face of desire, of love, of freedom, right up until the moment they don't. This is the story of the strongest man who ever lived, and why strength was never really his problem. Born in ancient Israel during one of its most turbulent eras, Samson entered the world with something almost no one is given. A destiny announced before birth. He was set apart, consecrated. His hair, never to be cut, was the outward sign of an inward covenant. From the beginning, he wasn't just a man, he was a symbol. And the power that followed him was almost mythological. He tore a lion apart with his bare hands. He defeated entire battalions alone. Walls couldn't hold him. Armies couldn't stop him. But here is what the story makes clear almost immediately. Samson's greatest vulnerability had nothing to do with his hair. It had to do with the choices he couldn't stop making. He married a woman his parents warned him against. He moved toward people and places that openly opposed everything he stood for. He played games with his own secrets. Over and over, the same patterns surfaced. Intimacy followed by betrayal, power followed by recklessness, warning followed by indifference. He wasn't a man undone by an enemy. He was a man undone by himself. In the early 20th century, the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung introduced a concept that would quietly reshape how we understand human behavior. He called it the shadow. The shadow in Jungian psychology is not evil. It is simply everything we have pushed out of conscious awareness, the desires we won't admit, the impulses we've buried under identity, the parts of ourselves we cannot reconcile with who we believe we are. Jung's insight was both simple and devastating. We don't eliminate the shadow by ignoring it. We feed it. The more rigidly a person defines themselves, the more tightly they hold an identity, the more powerful the shadow beneath becomes. And eventually, it doesn't ask permission anymore. It acts through us, while we watch, confused, wondering why we keep ending up in the same place. Samson was consecrated from birth, holy, set apart. His entire identity was built on divine purpose and extraordinary strength. But beneath that identity lived something unexamined, something that kept pulling him toward the very world he was supposed to stand against. And he never once stopped to ask why. Here is a psychological truth that is easy to overlook. The more an identity is imposed rather than chosen, the more the psyche resists it. Samson did not choose his calling. It was declared over him before he could speak. His entire selfhood was structured around a role he was assigned. And with that came a set of rigid rules, expectations, and separations that defined what he was allowed to want. Jung would call this the construction of the persona, the public mask a person builds to meet the world's expectations of them. The persona isn't dishonest, but it is always incomplete. Because everything the persona excludes, every desire, every forbidden impulse, every unacknowledged need, gets pushed into the shadow. And the greater the persona, the darker and more powerful the shadow that forms beneath it. Samson's first act of recorded defiance isn't violent. It's romantic. He sees a Philistine woman and tells his parents, "I want her." They object. He says, "Get her for me." This isn't just stubbornness. This is the shadow speaking its first full sentence. The part of him that had spent a lifetime being told what he was, finally reaching for what it wanted. And no one around him, including Samson, had the language to understand what was actually happening. What comes next in Samson's story is not a series of mistakes. It is a repetition compulsion, one of the most well-documented patterns in behavioral psychology. Repetition compulsion describes the unconscious tendency to recreate situations that caused harm, not out of masochism, but out of an unresolved psychological need. The psyche keeps returning to the scene of the original wound, hoping, unconsciously, to finally resolve it. Samson is repeatedly drawn to Philistine women, to dangerous proximity, to environments where his identity is at risk. He doesn't stumble into these situations. He walks toward them, eyes open. In Big Five personality terms, his profile is striking, extremely low in agreeableness when it comes to authority and constraint, and extremely high in what psychologists call sensation-seeking, the need for stimulation, novelty, and risk that in some individuals overrides the brain's normal threat detection. But beneath all of that runs something more specific. Samson seems drawn to the very intimacy that requires him to be vulnerable, as if the man who could defeat armies needed to find the one arena where his strength was irrelevant. That is not recklessness. That is longing. Poorly understood, never spoken, acted out instead. Out. 3 times, Samson is pressed by Delilah to reveal the source of his strength. 3 times, he gives her a false answer. 3 times, she uses that answer to try to incapacitate him. And then, he tells her the truth. This moment has fascinated scholars and psychologists for centuries, because it makes no rational sense. He had already seen the pattern. He already knew what she was doing. The evidence was in front of him, repeated 3 times, and still, he told her. Jung would call this shadow possession, the moment the unconscious takes over so completely that the conscious mind no longer directs behavior. The person watches themselves act against their own survival instincts as if from a distance. But there is another lens worth placing here: self-disclosure as surrender. For a man whose entire life had been defined by what he could not share, a sacred covenant, an identity he didn't choose, a power he could never fully explain, being known may have felt more important than being safe. Delilah didn't take his secret. He gave it, fully, willingly, because some part of him may have been exhausted by the weight of being exceptional. After betrayal, after capture, after blindness, Samson is led into the temple of his enemies, a spectacle, a broken symbol, the strongest man alive, now chained, sightless, performing for the crowd that despised him. And in that darkness, something shifts. The text says his hair had begun to grow back. But psychologically, what actually grew back was something more significant: clarity. When the external persona is finally, completely stripped away, when there is nothing left to perform, no identity to protect, no strength to display, the psychological noise quiets. What remains is something raw, honest, and essential. In his final moment, Samson asks for strength one last time, not to conquer, not to rule, but to bring down the structure that had been built on false power. Jungian psychology calls the confrontation with the shadow, when it is finally faced rather than fled, individuation, the process of becoming whole. It is rarely comfortable. It almost always costs something. For Samson, it cost everything. But in the ruins of his persona, in the silence of his blindness, he may have finally, for the first time, known himself. You don't have to be consecrated from birth to understand Samson's psychology. Think of the high achiever who has spent decades performing a version of themselves built entirely around other people's expectations. The successful child, the reliable partner, the indispensable professional. From the outside, the identity looks stable. Internally, the shadow is gathering pressure. And then, inexplicably, they make a choice that seems to unravel everything. An affair, a sudden resignation, a public outburst that shocks everyone who thought they knew them. People around them say, "I don't know what happened. It came out of nowhere." It didn't come from nowhere. It came from somewhere very deep, that was never given a voice. Or consider the person who keeps choosing the same kind of relationship, Different face, same dynamic. The partner who withholds. The connection that begins with intensity and ends with betrayal. And no matter how clearly they see the pattern after the fact, the next time arrives and the pull is just as strong. That is not weakness. That is an unresolved wound expressing itself the only way it knows how, through behavior. Samson's story is in every person who has ever wondered, in the wreckage of something they themselves dismantled. Why do I keep doing this? The answer Jung would offer is not moral. It is structural. What we refuse to bring into the light does not disappear. It finds its own way out. The story of Samson has survived thousands of years, not because it is a story about strength, but because it is a story about what lives beneath strength and what happens when it goes unexamined for an entire lifetime. Every one of us carries a shadow, built from everything we were told to suppress, everything we decided was too complicated to face, everything that didn't fit the identity we needed to maintain. The question Samson's story leaves behind is not, how do you stop being self-destructive? It is quieter than that. It is, what part of yourself have you never introduced yourself to? Because the things we refuse to see in ourselves don't become weaker over time. They just learn to work in the dark. If this kind of psychological exploration speaks to you, if you found yourself somewhere in this story, subscribe. Because every week we go deeper into the minds that shaped the ancient world and what they still reveal about ours. Like this video if it made you think, and drop a comment below. What part of Samson's psychology hit closest to home? We will read every one.